Lena had always been an independent woman. She had raised her children, Sarah and Ben, with the idea that they should learn to stand on their own. She never hovered over them or tried to control their lives. She believed in giving them the freedom to make their own decisions and mistakes, knowing that the best lessons often came from experience. She had been a single mother, working long hours to provide for them, and while the absence of a father figure was never ideal, she made sure to fill that gap with love, encouragement, and practical guidance. Over the years, Lena became accustomed to her role as the strong, silent type, someone who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but never burdened her children with her worries. She had always handled things on her own. But now, in her early 60s, things were different. Lena had started to feel the first signs of aging. Her joints weren't as flexible, her energy levels were lower than they used to be, and her mind didn't always work as sharply as it once did. The once smooth lines of her face had given way to wrinkles, and her once vibrant brown hair was turning silver, a reminder that time was passing, whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. She wasn't the woman who could take on everything by herself anymore, but admitting that fact was hard. Her relationship with Sarah and Ben, both now in their late 20s and early 30s, had become strained over the years. There had been moments of closeness, of course, birthdays, holidays, the occasional family gathering, but those moments had grown fewer and farther apart. The calls had become less frequent, and when they did speak, it was mostly about trivial things. Sarah was busy with her career, always on the go, and Ben had his own life in a different city, a life that often seemed far removed from the one Lena had raised him in. There had been no big falling out between them. It wasn't that Lena's children had turned away from her, but rather that, over time, they had drifted into their own worlds. They were adults now, and naturally, their lives had become their own. Lena had tried to tell herself that it was just part of the process. Kids grow up, they have their own lives to live, and it was unreasonable to expect them to constantly revolve around her. Yet, in the quiet moments when she was alone, the loneliness crept in. The occasional pangs of regret tugged at her heart. Had she done enough? Had she been the kind of mother who prepared them not just for adulthood, but for what came after? Lena had always been the one to make the hard decisions, to steer them in the right direction, to solve the problems they faced. But now, she found herself questioning if she had ever truly talked to them about the future, about the things that really mattered, the things that they would need to know someday when she was no longer around to guide them. One evening, Lena sat in her living room, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hand, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over the neighborhood. It was a peaceful moment, but as she sat there, she couldn't shake the thought that it was all too quiet. Her phone sat next to her, a text from Sarah blinking on the screen. "Hey, Mom. How are you?" It was a simple question, but it was the type of exchange that had become all too common, brief, impersonal, and disconnected. Lena had always prided herself on being the kind of mother who understood her children, who knew what they needed before they even asked for it. But now, she couldn't help but feel like she was losing touch with them. They were no longer the children she had raised with such care and attention. They were adults with their own priorities, their own lives, and she was just a footnote in the background. She typed out a response, but paused before hitting send. What should she say? How could she convey the things she needed to share? She knew the day would come when she wouldn't be around anymore, and the thought terrified her. What if they weren't prepared for the decisions they would have to make without her? What if they didn't know what she wanted, what she needed, what her wishes were? She had never wanted to burden them with her own anxieties or fears, but now she realized that she had been keeping too much to herself. It was then that the full weight of her realization hit her. She had never really talked to her children about the future. She had never discussed what would happen when she couldn't take care of herself anymore, or what her wishes were for her final years. She had never shared the details of her will, or what she wanted in terms of health care, or even what kind of care she might need if her health deteriorated. It wasn't something she had avoided deliberately, but she had always thought she had more time. After all, she was still young, relatively speaking. She had always been independent, always able to take care of herself. But now, with her health starting to show signs of wear, The reality of the future seemed so much closer. And the thought that she might leave her children with nothing but confusion and uncertainty made her stomach churn. Lena stared at her phone again. She had to talk to them. But how could she bring it up? How could she approach the subject without sounding morbid, without making them feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed? She didn't want to scare them, but she also knew that the time was now before it was too late. The idea of discussing her own mortality made her uneasy, but it was also a realization that the inevitable was approaching. She had spent her life taking care of them, but she had never considered how they might take care of her when the time came. The thought of being a burden to them was something she had avoided acknowledging, but it was a reality she couldn't ignore anymore. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "Everything okay, Mom? You've been quiet lately." Lena stared at the message for a moment, contemplating her next move. She could brush it off, send a quick reply, and go on as if everything were fine. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be. She couldn't continue to ignore the elephant in the room. If she didn't start talking to them about what the future held, there was a real risk that when it came time to face those challenges, they wouldn't be ready. And that scared her more than anything else. She put the phone down and took a deep breath. There was no easy way to start this conversation, but it was necessary. If she didn't do it now, there might never be another chance. And one day, she would regret not having said something when she had the opportunity. In that moment, Lena made a decision. She would talk to her children. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be the right thing to do. She would explain her fears, her hopes, and her wishes. She would let them know that, while she was still able, she wanted to make sure they were prepared for the decisions that lay ahead, and for the day when they would have to face those decisions without her. Lena knew that talking about the future wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to ensure that when the time came, she wouldn't leave them in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, it would bring them closer together again. It had been 2 months since Lena had last reached out to her children about the future. Despite her best intentions, she hadn't yet found the right moment to start those conversations. Every time she thought about it, the weight of the task made her hesitant. The fear of making her children uncomfortable or worse, pushing them away with her concerns, was paralyzing. She knew she had to speak with them. She couldn't afford to leave things unsaid any longer, but she didn't know how to begin. Then life, in its inescapable way, intervened. Lena had always been active. Even though her body wasn't what it used to be, she made sure to go for a walk every morning. The fresh air, the rhythm of her footsteps, and the quiet of the early hours helped clear her mind. But lately, her morning walks had been harder. A few times, she had found herself slightly winded, and there was a pain in her knees that she hadn't experienced before. It was nothing major, just a dull ache that lingered a little longer each day, but it unsettled her. It wasn't the first sign of aging, but it was the first sign that she couldn't just ignore. One Friday afternoon, after a walk, Lena had gone to the local grocery store to pick up a few things. She was feeling unusually tired, but she chalked it up to the heat of the day. As she reached for a can of tomatoes on a high shelf, she felt her body suddenly give way beneath her. In a split second, her legs buckled, and before she could catch herself, she collapsed onto the floor. The impact was jarring, and for a moment, the world spun around her. A sharp pain shot through her left ankle, and her heart raced in a panic. Her breath became shallow, and she struggled to sit up, trying to steady herself. The scene was chaotic, people around her rushing to help, calling out for assistance. But all she could focus on was the throbbing in her ankle and the overwhelming sensation that she had just crossed some invisible line. Someone had called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly, and Lena was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. The ride to the hospital was a blur, too fast, too disorienting. When they finally arrived, Lena was given an X-ray, which revealed that her ankle was sprained but not broken. Still, the doctors were concerned. The fall was not just a random accident. It was a result of her body starting to show signs of weakness, of aging, something she had never fully accepted. "Lena, you need to be more careful," the doctor said gently. "This isn't just about a sprained ankle. There are other things we need to consider. Your bone density isn't what it used to be. You might be at risk for more falls like this in the future." The words stung more than she expected. She knew she wasn't getting any younger, but to hear it from a doctor, to have it laid out so clearly in front of her, made the truth undeniable. She was aging. She wasn't invincible anymore. And this fall, this small accident, was just a warning, a sign that her body wasn't going to hold up forever. Lena left the hospital with crutches, a prescription for painkillers, and a set of instructions on how to take care of her injury. But there was something else in her mind, something far more unsettling than the pain in her ankle. What if this was just the beginning? What if, in a few years, she wasn't able to walk without assistance? What if she couldn't take care of herself anymore? What if the next fall wasn't so minor? The thoughts haunted her in the days that followed, keeping her awake at night. She found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the weight of her situation began to settle on her shoulders. What would happen if her children weren't prepared to help her? What if they didn't know what to do? Or worse, if they resented the burden she was placing on them? She had always been the one to take care of everything. She had raised them on her own, worked hard to provide, and never let them see her weaknesses. But now, she couldn't ignore the fact that she was vulnerable. And the realization that she couldn't continue to manage everything by herself was more terrifying than anything she had ever faced. The next day, Lena tried to call Sarah, but her daughter didn't answer. Lena wasn't surprised. Sarah had a busy life, a demanding job, and Lena had always tried to be understanding of her daughter's schedule. But as the hours went by, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't that Sarah didn't love her. Lena knew that deep down. But over the years, their communication had become more strained. Sarah was always busy, always rushing from one thing to the next. And Lena had never wanted to impose, never wanted to burden her with her own worries. But now, as the reality of her aging body became impossible to ignore, Lena couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Later that evening, Lena left a message for Sarah, trying to sound casual, even though her heart was heavy. "Hey, sweetheart, I just wanted to check in. I had a little fall today at the store. It's nothing serious, just a sprain. But I think it's time we talk about some things, about the future. Anyway, call me when you get a chance. Love you." The message felt oddly final. She had never been one to talk about such things, to open up in a way that exposed her vulnerabilities. But something had shifted inside her. The fall had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the future was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Sarah didn't call back that night, nor did she the next day. Lena didn't press the issue. She didn't want to seem desperate. But deep down, she could feel the emotional distance between them growing wider. Lena couldn't help but wonder if, even if she did talk to Sarah, would her daughter be ready to hear it? Would she be prepared for the reality of what was coming? The next week, as Lena was recovering, she received a call from Ben. He had been busy with his own life, living in another city, starting his career, and adjusting to adulthood, but he made the effort to check in every once in a while. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice warm but distant. "How's the ankle? I heard about what happened. You okay?" Lena smiled softly. Ben had always been the more sensitive of the two. "I'm fine," she reassured him, though she wasn't. "It's just a sprain. Nothing to worry about." There was a brief pause before Ben spoke again. "I'm glad you're okay. Listen, I've been thinking about what you said in your message. About the future. I know we haven't really talked about it much, but maybe it's time we did. I want to be there for you, Mom, when you need me. But I also want to make sure you're okay with all of this. It's not easy, Lena felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't realized she was missing. A connection, a deep sense of understanding between her and her children. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her realize that the future didn't have to be something to fear. She didn't have to face it alone. If they were willing to talk, willing to face it together, maybe there was hope after all. That night, Lena sat down with a pen and paper, writing out a list of the things she needed to discuss with Sarah and Ben. It was daunting, but she knew it had to be done. She wasn't just concerned about the future for herself. She was concerned for them, too. They were her children, and they deserved to be prepared for what was coming, just as much as she needed to be prepared. The conversations would be difficult, no doubt, but they were the first step in a process that would shape the years to come. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a sense of clarity. The wake-up call had come, and it had forced her to face the future head-on. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Now, all she had to do was find the courage to take that first step. Lena spent the next several days in a sort of emotional limbo. The fall at the grocery store had been a wake-up call, but it wasn't just the physical injury that had shaken her. It was the realization of her own mortality and the quiet, unspoken truth that she wasn't as young as she used to be. For years, she had prided herself on being the rock, the strong one who always had everything under control. But now, with her ankles still healing and her body beginning to show signs of wear, Lena felt vulnerable in a way she never had before. She had tried to put the idea of talking to her children about the future out of her mind for as long as possible. She had hoped that somehow they would understand without her needing to spell it out, that they would know what she wanted, what she needed when the time came. But deep down, she knew that was unrealistic. There was no way for Sarah and Ben to be fully prepared if she didn't communicate her wishes clearly and directly. It wasn't just about the practical matters, though those were important. It was also about her emotional well-being, her peace of mind. She had spent so many years worrying about their futures, about making sure they were okay, that she had never stopped to think about her own future and what that might look like when she was no longer able to manage things on her own. The first step, she realized, was to talk to them. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be a one-time conversation. This was going to be an ongoing dialogue, a series of talks that would take place over time as they navigated the complexities of aging and family dynamics. But it had to start somewhere. Lena knew that if she didn't take that first step, she would regret it later. It was Sunday evening when she finally mustered the courage to call Sarah. For the past few days, Lena had been obsessively checking her phone, waiting for Sarah to reach out after her last message. But the response had been slow, and Lena began to wonder if her daughter was avoiding her. She wasn't angry. She understood that Sarah's life was busy, but a part of her couldn't help but feel a sense of abandonment. This wasn't just about her ankle or her health. It was about the future, a future they needed to face together. But she had to be patient, she reminded herself. She couldn't expect Sarah to understand everything all at once. When the phone rang and Sarah's name appeared on the screen, Lena felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. It had been too long since they had talked deeply about anything. The call started casually, with Sarah asking about her ankle, how she was feeling, if she needed anything. Lena answered her questions as best as she could, trying to keep the conversation light. But as the minutes passed, the weight of what she needed to say hung heavy in the air. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Lena said finally, her voice tentative. About the future." Sarah paused. "What do you mean?" Lena took a deep breath, her heart racing. "I don't want to scare you, sweetheart, but I've been getting older. You probably noticed that things are a little harder for me now. My ankle, for example. It's not just the sprain. There are other things happening with my body, things I can't ignore anymore." "I know, Mom," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with concern. "But you're doing okay, right? The doctor said it wasn't too serious." "I'm fine," Lena reassured her. "But what I'm trying to say is that I need to start thinking ahead about what happens when I can't take care of myself the way I used to. I've always been independent, but I can't keep pretending like I don't need help sometimes. And I need you to know what my plans are, what I'd want for the future." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lena felt a pang of fear. Had she said too much? Had she scared Sarah? She could hear her daughter breathing, her soft, measured breaths that indicated she was processing what had been said. "Mom, I don't know what to say," Sarah finally replied. "I guess I never really thought about it. I mean, we don't like to talk about that stuff. It's uncomfortable." Lena nodded, though Sarah couldn't see her. "I know, sweetheart. It's uncomfortable for me, too. But we need to talk about it. You and Ben need to know what I want, what my wishes are if anything happens to me. You need to know what kind of care I might need in the future, whether it's help with daily activities or medical care. I don't want you to be caught off guard if something happens. And I don't want you to have to make decisions without knowing what I would want." There was another long silence, and Lena could hear Sarah's voice crack slightly when she finally spoke. "I don't want you to feel like a burden, Mom. I don't know if I'm ready for this." Lena's heart ached. She could hear the emotion in Sarah's voice, the uncertainty, the fear. It wasn't just about Lena's health. It was about their relationship, too. They had never talked about these things before, and now they were both navigating uncharted waters. "I'm not asking you to do it alone," Lena said gently. "We'll figure it out together. But we need to start talking about it now. I don't want to leave you in the dark when it comes to my care, my finances, or any of that. It's too important." Sarah sniffled, and for the first time in a long time, Lena could hear the raw vulnerability in her voice. "Okay, Mom, I hear you. Let's talk about it. I'll come by next weekend, and we can figure this out." Lena felt a rush of relief wash over her. It wasn't going to be easy, and the conversation was far from over, but it was a start. They had cracked the door open, and that was the first step towards something better. Later that evening, Lena called Ben. The conversation was just as difficult, but in a different way. Ben was living in another city, starting his career, and he had always been the more independent of her two children. He didn't always call as often as Lena would have liked, and he was often distracted when they did talk. But Lena knew that this conversation was just as important with him as it had been with Sarah. When Ben picked up the phone, his voice was warm but tired. "Hey, Mom, how's the ankle?" "I'm getting better," Lena replied, trying to keep her tone light. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I need to talk to you about something important." Ben was silent for a moment, sensing the seriousness in her voice. "What's going on, Mom?" Lena took another deep breath. "It's about the future, Ben. My future. I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't think I can handle everything on my own anymore. I need to talk to you about what happens if something happens to me. I need to talk about my wishes for my care, for my finances, and what I want for the future." Ben was quiet for a long time, and Lena could hear the wheels turning in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm not sure I even know what to say, Mom. I've never really thought about this before. It's not something anyone wants to think about." "I know, honey," Lena said softly. "I didn't want to think about it either. But it's time. I need you and Sarah to understand what I want and what my plans are. I don't want to leave you both in the dark, and I want to make sure you're both prepared for whatever comes next." Ben didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Lena wondered if he was overwhelmed. But then he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I get it, Mom. I'll help. We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this." It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was the beginning of something important. Lena felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in weeks. Her children were listening, and though they were scared and uncertain, they were willing to engage. They weren't avoiding the subject, they were confronting it head-on, just like she needed them to. As the days passed, Lena continued to prepare for more in-depth discussions with Sarah and Ben. There was a lot to cover: healthcare plans, wills, funeral arrangements, and other difficult topics that had always seemed too morbid to discuss. But Lena knew that these conversations weren't just about her. They were about her children, too. They needed to know how to navigate the future with clarity, and they needed to be involved in decisions that would shape their lives long after she was gone. The conversations that followed were difficult, but they were also healing. They weren't just about planning for the future. They were about coming to terms with the inevitability of change and learning how to face it as a family. Lena realized that while she had spent years focusing on her children's futures, it was now time to focus on her own. And in doing so, she had brought her family closer together. They might not have all the answers, but they were united in their willingness to face the future together, one conversation at a time. Over the following months, Lena's relationship with her children began to evolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. What started as a difficult conversation about the future, the kind of conversation she had avoided for years, slowly grew into something deeper, something she had not expected. The act of sharing her vulnerabilities, of asking for help, and of preparing for what was coming allowed her to see her children not as the people she had raised, but as the adults they had become, with their own hopes, fears, and uncertainties. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt a sense of peace in the idea that she wouldn't have to face the future alone. When Sarah visited her a week later, they sat together in the living room, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The conversation that had begun so haltingly on the phone had now taken on a new form. It was no longer just about logistics, about care plans, or medical bills. It was about understanding each other as people, about opening up the lines of communication that had, for so long, been shut tight. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Sarah began, her voice hesitant but sincere. "About the future. I'm not going to lie, it's been hard to wrap my head around it. I don't think any of us really want to think about you getting older, or about the possibility that you won't be around forever. But I know that's not the reality. And I want to help. I want to be there for you, even if it's hard for me to admit it." Lena nodded, her eyes softening. She had spent so many years being strong for her children, always the one they could rely on, always the one to make everything okay. But in that moment, hearing Sarah acknowledge her own discomfort, Lena understood something profound. Vulnerability was not a weakness. It was an invitation to deeper connection. "I know this is hard," Lena replied, her voice gentle but steady. "But I need you to know that I'm not just talking about the physical stuff. I'm talking about being there for me, emotionally, too. I don't want to carry everything on my own anymore. I've done that for a long time, but I can't keep doing it. I need to know that we can lean on each other." Sarah reached out, placing her hand on Lena's. The gesture was small but powerful, a silent promise that they were in this together. "I want that too, Mom. I want to be part of your life, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones, too." Over the next few weeks, they continued to have more conversations, slowly but steadily breaking down the barriers of unspoken fears and expectations. Lena shared her health concerns, her wishes about the kind of care she wanted, and her thoughts about what would happen when the time came. But they also talked about things that were more difficult to voice. The emotional toll of aging, the loneliness that sometimes came with it, the fear of becoming a burden. Sarah began to open up as well, sharing her own worries about her career, about balancing her personal life with the demands of being a good daughter, about how she felt torn between her own family and the responsibility she knew she would have to take on as her mother's caregiver. It was messy, it was emotional, and it was uncomfortable, but it was real. In many ways, Lena found herself amazed at how much Sarah had changed since those early days of her childhood. She had always been the child who had needed reassurance, who had looked to Lena for answers. But now, Sarah was a woman who could see her mother as a person, not just as a provider. She was no longer just the daughter who needed care, but the adult who was beginning to understand what it meant to care for someone else. The next breakthrough came when Ben came to visit for a weekend. Lena had been dreading this conversation for weeks. While Sarah was open and honest about her fears, Ben had always been more closed off. He was the type to bottle up his emotions, to avoid difficult discussions. But Lena had learned that the only way to move forward was to be honest with him, just as she had been with Sarah. They sat together on the back porch, the evening air cool and crisp. The sound of birds chirping and the rustling of the leaves in the trees added an almost surreal calm to the moment. Lena could feel her heart racing as she turned to face Ben, her only son. "Ben," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about what I said before, about the future, and I want to make sure you know what I need, too." Ben didn't immediately respond, and Lena couldn't help but wonder if he was going to shut her down. But then he nodded, his eyes filled with a seriousness that she wasn't used to seeing from him. "I know," he said softly. "I know you need help, and I want to be there for you, Mom. I've been thinking about it, too. I don't know all the answers, but I want to make sure you're taken care of. I want to make sure you're okay. I just don't know how to do it all." Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had feared that Ben wouldn't be able to handle the responsibility, that he would shy away from the burden of caregiving. But here he was, admitting his fears, acknowledging his limitations, and offering his help anyway. It was all she could have hoped for. "I don't expect you to do everything," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to take on everything by yourself, but I need to know that we can work together, that we can figure this out as a family. I don't want to be a burden, but I also don't want to feel like I'm doing this alone." Ben reached across the table, grasping her hand tightly. "You won't be alone, Mom. I promise. We'll figure this out. You've always been there for me. Now it's my turn to be there for you." In that moment, Lena felt something shift within her. It wasn't just about her physical health or her medical needs. It was about something deeper, something intangible. It was about trust. It was about knowing that, even as she aged, her children would be there for her, just as she had always been there for them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough. As the weeks passed, the conversations continued, and Lena began to put her plans in motion. She talked to a lawyer about updating her will, making sure that everything was in place in case something unexpected happened. She made arrangements for long-term care insurance, and she researched different types of care facilities just in case she ever needed them. She also talked to a financial advisor to make sure her finances were in order. It wasn't easy. It was, in fact, one of the hardest things she had ever done. But it brought her a sense of peace to know that she was preparing for the future in a way she never had before. And while there were still difficult moments, times when Lena felt scared or overwhelmed, there were also moments of lightness. There were dinners with Sarah and Ben, where they laughed about old family memories, and quiet nights at home where they simply sat together, enjoying each other's company. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a kind of togetherness that transcended the fear and uncertainty of the future. Lena didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know if she would be able to live independently forever, or if there would come a time where she would need more help than her children could give. But what she did know was that she wasn't facing it alone. She had her children, and they had her. They had worked through the uncomfortable conversations, the fear, and the uncertainty. And in doing so, they had created something stronger than they had ever had before, a true sense of family. In the end, it wasn't about the plans or the legal documents or the insurance policies. It was about the bond they had strengthened, the understanding they had built. It was about the knowledge that whatever happened, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt a profound sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she was no longer afraid of it. She had faced the hardest conversations, and she had come out stronger on the other side. She knew that, in the end, that was all that really mattered. As she sat on the porch with Ben and Sarah that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lena knew that, whatever came next, she was ready. They all were. Together.